that, Craig brought up, what would the original Big 12's value be had everybody been nice, had everybody not eaten its own? And that includes first Nebraska and then Colorado and then Missouri and A&M and now Texas and Oklahoma. And the man with all of the analytics and data, Sam Bradshaw, took on the homework assignment and has spit out some pretty interesting stuff. Sam, thank you very much. Appreciate your patience getting to you here in this segment. But so when I asked you that question and passed it on with what Craig asked, is that something that kind of like immediately intrigued you to, I wonder what it might be?
Thanks for having me on. And honestly, it's one of those, there's a lot of unknowns. So we're really talking in ranges because anytime you're talking a deal, you're dealing with market conditions, you're dealing with who's buying, you're dealing with, is it an open market or is it an extension? What rights are they selling? You know, at some point, if the Big 12 had stuck together in their original group, would they have started a network? There's a lot of things that are unknown. So we're going to be mainly looking at just some broad assumptions. I went at this primarily looking at the current, or the future, I should say, Big 12. The 12 teams going forward have a contract for about $380 million. And let's just assume that the remaining 8, who make up 8 of the 12, so 2/3 of the membership, let's assume they make up somewhere between 2/3 and 3/4 of that total lump sum media value that's being divided, and the new additions combined for the rest. Well, we know that a lot of industry analyst sources estimated the total amount that Texas and Oklahoma contributed to the prior 10-team arrangement was supposed to be half the value. You know, half the lump sum that everybody's splitting. So take the 2/3 or 3/4 of the $380 million, whatever that is, you double that, and you've got an estimate of what it would be with Texas and Oklahoma. And then from there, I believe Chet Brown reported when Nebraska and Colorado left that they should have represented about 16% of the value lost. So you factor out another 16% from there. And then you kind of have a conservative estimate relative to what would that value be before we really don't have an estimate on how much value did you lose when you swapped out West Virginia and TCU for A&M and Missouri. You know, because West Virginia is a really strong brand, and they're a lot like Arkansas in the regard that they're a smaller state, but they draw a lot of eyeballs outside their state, particularly in Pittsburgh and D.C. And then TCU certainly had a strong program of recent years, but at the same time, their alumni base is not the same as the Aggies. And in particular, their rivalry game with Texas had not really been able to hold that Thanksgiving spotlight stage the way that game did. So there's obviously some value lost, but you also replace some value. And when you do a lot of these calculations and you back it out, the range I got was in the high 40 millions for schools, to the low 60 million. We're almost right at 60 million a school as an absolute dream scenario maximum. So you're probably talking in the high 40 million to low 50 million range, if I had to guess. And, you know, it depends on a lot of factors, but you're adding in a lot of top tier games as well. Nebraska facing off against Texas and Oklahoma, Nebraska, Colorado, which did 3 million the last couple times they played it in non-conference. Oklahoma, Nebraska, that just did 4 million and 3 million in non-conference in recent years. You've got a lot of big time games that would push that dollar number up.
Sam, how much of this also can you even factor in the fact that Nebraska and Colorado in particular, look, A&M's the same, Missouri's taking a little bit of a dip, obviously, but with those 3 teams that have been worse in the conferences they've gone to, how much does that increase the value of those particular games? Had they just stayed on being regularly consistent, Nebraska winning 9 games, Colorado occasionally contending for the North Conference title, Missouri being a regular participant in the conference title game?
Well, I didn't factor that in just from the simple standpoint. I wanted to keep it simple. defensible, easy to understand. But certainly the more success a program has, the better your valuation would be. That said, a lot of the problems that have happened in those programs are not necessarily tied to the conference they're in. Some of it might be, but if you're not handling your house very well, you're not necessarily going to handle your house any better just because you go down in terms of what league you're competing in. Some of those teams might do better had they stayed. Some of those teams might be in the exact same boat. If you make a bad coaching hire, it doesn't really matter whether a certain conference's logo is on your chest. If that coaching hire is a bad hire, your program's probably not going to be going to new heights.
Sam, how do you think a Big 12 network might have worked with the benefit of hindsight and looking at the numbers, the desire for brands these days, things of that nature? Obviously, they went a different direction, went Longhorn Network and all of that, but do you see like the potential that could have been there had things gone differently?
That was probably the tipping point for the Big 12's realignment future. Long before Longhorn Network was even an idea that Texas was taking seriously. Kevin Weiberg, the guy that started the Big Ten Network for the Big Ten, he left the Big 12 to go do that. When the Big 12 turned it down, he was their commissioner, and it was overwhelmingly voted down. Had they done that, they may have not been rated. They may have stayed together, and they may have expanded. But they didn't do that, and then they turned around and signed a Fox deal for Tier 2 rights that basically a year after they signed it, or a year after it started, they're getting paid like an average of, I think at the time it was $19.5 million for the entire conference, only to have the Tier 2 and Tier 3 TV market get reset by the Big Ten Network that was throwing off $6.5 million a school like a year into that contract starting for the Big 12. Because their top 19 or so games, their top games, that contract with ABC at the time was extremely competitive with the SEC deal that would be signed with CBS the following year. It was competitive with what the Pac-10 at the time had. But the failure to accurately and efficiently monetize that back half of their inventory is what put the Big 12 in a bind. If they had handled that part of it better, we may be talking about an intact Big 12 that potentially went after some Big East schools, or potentially they may have gone after the Pac-12 way back when, because the Pac-12 was in a similar contract situation as well.
All right, so of the 6 teams, or now 8, right? There's been TCU, West Virginia, and now the incoming 4 that have joined the conference. Brigham Young seems to probably have the biggest clout. Is that correct as far as value, TV value, or is it somebody else?
Of the new 4, it's got to be BYU. They have the biggest historical brand. They're one of the most winning programs since the 80s. And you're talking that 18 to 45-year-old demographic, they're right at the top edge of that with when they started being prevalent on the national stage. They've got a national title, whether or not you want to dive too deeply into the strength of schedule that year. They still have a national title. They've got a Heisman winner. It's a storied program. They deliver eyeballs consistently. They've got a big enrollment, and even beyond that, they've got a bit of a strong religious following just among Mormons in general, because they're so tied in with that church. They are likely the strongest brand that's been added in the recent bout. The only addition to the Big 12 that, if you valued them when they're going 3-9, if you valued them when they're going 6-6, when you value them when they're going 9-3, and you just look, given equal results, the only addition the Big 12 has made since they added anybody would potentially be West Virginia. They're the only one that I would really say might have the clout to even debate it. And even then, BYU's tough to knock off that pedestal.
Sam Bradshaw, 365 Sports, SicEm365 Radio, who does a lot of the prep work when it comes to Baylor and opponents they're going to play each week in football, but has been a rock star when it comes to data, analytics, and much more, looking at the open windows, what's available, and also the value among television deals within the Big 12 and other conferences too.
But Sam, if you don't expect Texas and Nebraska and Oklahoma and Missouri to look back and kick themselves for making this financial decision, do you?
No, from a financial standpoint, they're making more than they would have at the time that they left the conference. You'd have to go further back than any of them left in order to find any kind of alternate history with better decisions made that could have been competitive with that. These decisions are being made for money, and the Big 12 didn't set themselves up in a way to potentially compete on that playing field the way they needed to hold the teams. But they're doing well with what they have now, and they're going to chart the best path forward. To the extent that any of the schools look back to the Big 12 with a tear in their eye, they'll be dabbing that tear with a massive pile of money. So it's not exactly the type of longing that's going to make anybody lose any sleep.
So you mentioned Brigham Young, and we know their history and also the value there and the eyeballs. But of the other three, Cincinnati, and obviously a very populated state in Ohio, UCF, which is in what is a great fertile place when it comes to recruiting in Florida, plus Orlando, et cetera. But then Houston, even though there's some that, they don't have any eyeballs in Houston, they've proven at times they do based on who they are. But is there value in Houston, maybe more in them in the future than the other three?
If I had to place more future value on any one of the three, I would probably say UCF, just because there are people who, there are still people who were born around the time that they got into a remotely regional conference with any kind of TV exposure at the FBS level. That's how young they are. Like, they only started playing FBS in 96, something like that. And when you think about what that does with their donor base, and when you think about just how big they are, and I understand all three of these schools have these so-called commuter label, but even when you subdivide their enrollment by how many people have lived on campus at some point and how many actually graduate and just how many were full-time students, the kind of demographics that would mimic what you would get at a typical residential four-year university that wouldn't have the commuter label applied to them, they're still a huge school. And they're all young relative to a lot of these other schools. So you've got to think their donor base, their fan base, and then the fact that there's no pro sports competition in Orlando, long term, they're going to grow. Mm-hmm. And that's probably why there was a lot of justification for creating another geographical outlier through that expansion, because that value was observed. As far as Houston, they certainly have the potential to grow, and they've certainly got a fair amount of history. They have the old SWC brand. You've got Bill Yeoman. You've also got the Run and Shoot. You've also got Phi Slamma Jamma. You've got a lot of history there. But as far as growth, I'd probably have to lean towards UCF. And then in terms of just recent success, UCF and Cincinnati have been very consistent over the last decade. Well, UCF had a couple down years, but for the most part, their peaks have been much like Baylor. They've had 2-3 seasons that have been really good.
So let's get to the details one more time. Had the Big 12 remained intact based on today's value, based on the information you've looked at, their TV contract, the media deal, would be somewhere in the neighborhood of the mid to upper 40s to the lower, possibly at the ceiling of the 60 million per school?
Depending on how you go about it and what kind of projection you're looking at, you could rationalize anything from the low 40 million range to a peak of about 60 million. Personally, I think you're probably looking somewhere in the 48 to 53 range. But again, as mentioned before, it depends on the situations contractually. Like, are they locked into a long-term deal? Is this a pure open market sale? Is it a negotiation for that, or is it just immediate extension where there's not as much immediate competition? There's a lot of things that could push that number up or down, but I feel like the number would be in that range because you're adding 3 or 4 really strong brands and a couple support brands as well.
Yep.
And from there, you're also adding back St. Louis and Denver into the mix, and you've got a lot to potentially puts some of those big matchups on. You know, you've got the Thanksgiving game with Texas and A&M. You've got Colorado, Nebraska. You've got Oklahoma, Nebraska, and then you've got A&M versus Colorado or Nebraska. It gives you a lot of big matchups that even if the teams aren't necessarily knocking out of the park in that given year, people who've watched college football a long time recognize those helmets, they recognize those brands, and they tune in.
Sam, thank you for doing that. I know that it was an extra homework assignment, but you're great at it. We appreciate your time. Thank you so much, and we hope to have you on again soon.
Thanks, Muggy.
Thank you, Sam Bradshaw. S11_ I think it's Baylor, right? With us, and all of his details, stats, figures.